What follows is a brief discussion of semiconductors, including their pertinence to resource adequacy. Semiconductors are also called integrated circuits, or ICS. They are also called microchips and sometimes just called chips. It's hard to imagine life without our electronic gadgets, and we would not have them without semiconductors. Semiconductors, is there a downside to these intricate, beautiful, ingenious components we rely on so heavily? Is the cost of semiconductor production offset by their long-term benefit? To weigh this, we must look at the scale of cost and benefit. Both cost and benefit are enormous. The benefits to our daily life are probably quite obvious, and their benefits are related to purpose and function. Semiconductors lie between conductor and insulator, controlling and managing the flow of electric current in electronic equipment and devices. They are vital components of all integrated electronic systems, including but not limited to cell phones, TVs, computers, video games, cars, medical diagnostic equipment, aircraft. Silicon is a prominent component of most semiconductors. It really could be considered the prominent component. And fortunately, is found in minerals that make up 90% of the Earth's crust, so it is very plentiful. It's also very beautiful. Substitutes have been and are being developed that are substitutes for silicon have been and are being developed that are extremely expensive. So far, nothing has been an adequate substitute. Other components of semiconductors are germanium and gallium. Again, it's hard to imagine life without our devices. The first US-built silicon transistor was in 1947, and this is a replica of what it looked like. Prior to that, it was the more awkward and larger tubes. Manufacturing transistors out of silicon allowed them to be made small enough to fit on a microchip. Rapidly progressive developments in semiconductor technology have made electronic devices smaller, faster, and more reliable. Before silicon-based chips, computers were large and fragile, made of tubes and dials. They took up whole rooms. They were getting smaller. Here's kind of a little synopsis of the generators of computers, first to fifth. And those generations are ongoing. Quite amazing. Semiconductors are a marvel of technological genius. Hundreds of millions of transistors on each chip. Semiconductors bring increased energy efficiency, higher power capacity, flexibility to produce energy where and when needed. Semiconductors power the global economy. Semiconductor business interlinks the world. Raw materials from the United States, Japan, and Mexico primarily, and production in the United States and China. Trillions of semiconductors are in daily use around the world in every country of the world. This slide depicts the US-China interconnection from semiconductor materials to semiconductor sales. The global semiconductor industry market size was $574 billion in 2022. Semiconductors, in turn, power every other thriving, expanding industry. All electronically sophisticated energy generation systems use semiconductors. Wind and solar energy systems and electric vehicles use more than nuclear, coal, and natural gas systems. It's a very beautiful photo. Electric cars on average have about 2,000 semiconductors, approximately double that of conventional cars. Without semiconductors, there would be no electric vehicle chargers, no solar, wind, or electric vehicle options. Semiconductors are absolutely required for solar and wind power. Coal and natural gas produced power before the invention of semiconductors. The intermittency of solar and wind sources of energy require facilitation by semiconductors for their increased demand on the grid. High-power semiconductors are essential for transmission of solar and wind power to the grid. So semiconductors make the world go round, giving people around the world an unprecedented lifestyle. So what's the downside? The downside of semiconductors includes environmental impact from mining to production. It requires copious energy, water, land. Most of the energy is hydrocarbon sources. Also, the reliance on foreign countries for mining and manufacturing is problematic. So as I said, the mining requires copious hydrocarbon, fuel, water, and land. Here's some examples of the mining needed for semiconductors. Here's some photos of silicon mining. And that one down there on the bottom, the last one that I put up, to get a perspective of how large these mines are, just look at the vehicles that are there in the parking lot, and it gives you an idea of the expanse of land used in this case for silicon mining. Here are photos of germanium and gallium mining. Again, large expanses of land required, and also a lot of petroleum and water. So that's talking about some of the downside of mining. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the downside of manufacturing. And of course, this is all related. The reliance on foreign sources of semiconductors and silicon is problematic. Requires enormous amounts of energy and heavy reliance on hydrocarbon sources of fuel. Here's a list of the countries. You can see that the largest producers of these semiconductors are Taiwan and South Korea. Here's a graph of the U.S. imports of semiconductors in millions of U.S. dollars. We still import silicon. These are the countries that we import it from. The fastest growing U.S. import markets in silicon from 2020 to 21 were China, Germany, and Japan. We still import germanium and gallium. There was a headline in Bloomberg, July 3rd of this year, China to restrict exports of metals critical to chip production. And that was primarily germanium and gallium. Semiconductor manufacturing requires enormous amounts of energy. There was a study published in this year by Greenpeace called Invisible Emissions, with a focus on semiconductors. I can't vouch for the credibility of Greenpeace writing these articles, but it was 50 pages long and had 53 references. And then there was a 2-page executive summary. It talked about the manufacturing of semiconductors. This Greenpeace Invisible Emissions Executive Summary said the following: semiconductor manufacturing is projected to consume 237 terawatt hours of electricity globally in 2030. That amount is close to Australia's entire 2021 electricity consumption. Semiconductor manufacturing is projected to emit 86 tons of CO2, equivalent in 2030 to more than Portugal's 2021 total emissions of CO2. And most of the electricity used is from hydrocarbon sources. Another thing that was pointed out in the executive summary is when they talked about those totals from Australia and Portugal, that did not include the electricity used for display manufacturing and final assembly. So there's a long process to making these things. So semiconductors, I think it's pretty clear their pertinence to resource adequacy. The bottom line, there's no free lunch. Semiconductors that bring us our sought-after lifestyle and make solar and wind power possible, they bear a high cost to the grid and to the environment. Thank you for listening.